Kalev and I want to do is take a look at some of the more traditional tools that we've used, like the marketing funnel, and show you how we might be able to reimagine those for a world that we live in today that truly is digitized. So I thought I'd start today by going to a handful of statistics that I think are very interesting and telling of where the world we live in lies today. So first, you might be interested to know that only 30% of organizations still engage in cold calling. So why is this important? Well, cold calling has always been a staple of business-to-business and business-to-consumer sales operations, right? It's something that we would receive tons of these calls in the 80s, but what we find is that very few organizations actually do cold calling anymore. Because the idea that we might just call into somebody who just so happens to be in the midst of a buying decision is sort of ludicrous these days. They have too many tools at their disposal in the digital world to not have already done their research. Furthermore, the notion that we would call in and convince somebody that they have a buying need is even further far-fetched. Next, 57% of purchase decisions are completed before a supplier is contacted. This is one that scares the heck out of me. Because what this says is that every time the phone rings at your business with a potential lead, more than half the time, they've actually already decided to go with somebody else. So while you're all excited, your marketing efforts have paid off, that somebody has actually called the phone lines or sent you an email about working with them, the reality is they probably already know they're going to be going with somebody else. So when you take these two statistics together, what you find is that the environment for generating awareness today and generating leads is more difficult and more expensive than it's ever been, which makes the next statistic even more amazing. So studies have shown that about 55% of B2B marketers have programs dedicated to client retention. So in other words, there's 45%, or roughly half, that don't have programs dedicated to client retention. And of course, I just told you that that whole process of generating a lead, much less a client, is more difficult than ever. So why aren't we focused on our clients? And then I'll give you one more, and that is that more than 75% of buyers are very likely to refer their firm. So we know that once we have a client, they're willing to refer more business into us, yet 50% of the time, we actually don't have programs dedicated to client retention, right? So as we think about this, right, all of these things have changed because of digital. But I would also argue that the clients that One North works with also face additional challenges. Traditional marketing models were developed in a time when big television advertising by big B2C companies was all the rage. And we actually talked about this a little bit at our experience lab in 2014, a few months ago. And we spoke about a concept that was recently introduced by a fellow by the name of Seth Godin, and it's called the TV industrial complex. And the idea behind the TV industrial complex is that we all as marketers have been conditioned to market in a certain way. And that way is to plan at the end of the year for the next big campaign that we'll be rolling out in the following year, develop those plans, develop the budget, start producing them, and then roll it out in the subsequent year because we're marketing to the masses. That was all the rage when television first came about because marketers clamored to get their advertisements on television. It's a great way to meet a mass audience. But that is not the way your audience buys or becomes aware of you anymore. So we wanted to take a look at some of the ways in which our clients might be different than those organizations that are stuck in the TV industrial complex. And what we found was that our clients truly are different, right? So I wanted to run a quick quiz. And of course, I can't audit you because this is a webinar and I can't see the hands raised in the room. But what I'm going to ask you to do is raise your hand. And if you can say false to any of the statements I'm going to make, you can put your hand down. Of course, I can't audit you, as I said. So first, revenue generation is not transactional in your business. In other words, if somebody can buy your product or service anonymously by putting in a shopping cart, you can lower your hand. The buying decision is a long process. So in your business, if there is a short cycle to buying your product or service, then you can lower your hand. Your valued client is easily or quickly replaced. So what we're speaking to here is switching costs. If there are high switching costs, whether those switching costs are direct in terms of it's going to cost the client money to actually switch away from your product or service, or indirect in that they might have to expend additional resources to do so. If your value is easily replaced, you can lower your hand. Client relationships are complex, involving multiple touch points between several individuals. If your product or service can be sold very easily through one individual, or maybe even through a website for that matter, you can lower your hand. Current clients are an important source of new revenue. And the last one, what your clients feel about and say about your business strongly impacts the decisions of other clients. If that's not true, if you operate in a vacuum where your clients don't talk to each other, and you can sell your product or service without any concern about the network effects of your clients actually discussing your product or service, then you can lower your hand. Well, what I'm guessing here, and again, I can't actually see your hands, what I'm guessing is you probably still have your hand raised. And if you have your hand raised, what we would say is that you are what we like to call a relationship-based business. And that means you're fundamentally different than an organization that could say false to the statements that are on here. It also means that the traditional marketing funnel that we're all aware of might not meet your objectives. So the traditional marketing funnel, just to give a quick recap, it's a great, simple tool to understand how an organization markets itself and generates a sale, right? You generate a number of leads at the beginning, at the top of the funnel, and you add those leads into the funnel, and of course at the bottom, through a process of evaluation and qualification, those leads whittle down to a few select buyers, and those people actually execute a sale or sign a contract with your organization. Very simple model. It's been used forever. Now, the problem with this is that it works really well for non-relationship-based organizations, but for relationship-based organizations, not so much. So I'll tell you why. First is, in our world, the right audience is more valuable than a large one. We are not going to be running, or none of our clients are going to be running Super Bowl ads to millions of people in order to generate a client base of thousands or hundreds of thousands. In fact, we have clients that will spend a month of resources of several people pitching one particular client because they know that if they sign up that client, it can be worth millions or tens of millions of dollars to them on a recurring basis or in a particular transaction or whatever, or what have you, I should say. Second, buying decisions are only the beginning of the conversation. So what we find here is that this model, the marketing funnel, really doesn't speak to buying decisions that take place after the sale has actually occurred. And that speaks to the next 2 points, which are all about loyalty and influence. This funnel has no room for loyalty. So what happens when I have a loyal client? They've executed a sale with me. I've done an engagement for them. Then what happens? How does that impact what they buy from me in the future? How does that impact what others buy from me in the future and what they say about us? So the marketing funnel, generally speaking, isn't a great model for the environment we live in today, right? The environment where we are both relationship-based businesses as well as relationship-based businesses operating in an increasingly digital world. So where are we going to go with this? Well, what we'd like to do is introduce the relationship cycle. And we've spoken about this before, but I will start at the top and discuss the various aspects of the cycle and why we like it. So if you think about your client, the first thing they have to do is identify a need. They have to have some sort of stimulus that tells them that they need to buy a product or service. That's the perfect time where you as an organization can generate awareness that you can be a solution provider to them. You want to be in that set of folks they might approach. Ultimately, they will begin to research a solution, right? And researching a solution can take many shapes or forms. It might mean going to the internet. It might mean calling a trusted source, probably all of the above. And during that time, you want to drive consideration. You want to present yourself as an organization that can help solve their problem. Ultimately, they go into an active evaluation phase. They've got their competitive set of possible solution providers, and they're going to evaluate who is the best one to meet their needs. Of course, you're following up during this period. And ultimately, if all goes according to plan, they formalize a relationship with you. They select you as their vendor of choice, and they formalize that relationship. And this is generally speaking where the traditional marketing funnel sort of ends. But for a relationship-based business, it extends beyond formalizing the relationship. In fact, I think part of the power of this model is that it focuses on what happens after the relationship is formalized. Because that is when they begin to experience your service. And when they experience your service, they establish trust and they become advocates of yours. And the next time they identify a need, rather than going back out into the marketplace and researching solutions and actively evaluating them, they come back to you and they short-circuit that whole process and they go into what's called the loyalty loop. These are very, very profitable clients. But beyond just being profitable clients who come back to you with need after need, there's another benefit. And that benefit is that they are providing loyalty and influence, discussing your product and service with others that are involved in that outer loop, the stage where they are researching a solution or actively evaluating a particular set of vendors. And that's the beauty of the loyalty loop. And we would argue that relationship-based business today really looks more like this than it does the marketing funnel, your sales process. Now, the reason we like this model is because it is pretty simple. And you can look at it and you can start to understand which parts of the cycle that you need to focus on. For example, you might get a lot of your business from current clients, and maybe you feel there's not a lot of opportunity there anymore. Well, then are you focusing enough on generating awareness? Or you might find that, we're really good at generating awareness, and we love it when we get new clients, and that's what our culture is all about. But wait a second, shouldn't we be focused on the loyalty loop? Shouldn't we be focusing on our current clients? Because there's more money to be made there, and frankly, it's a lot less expensive to do that. So we like this model a lot for helping to plot your various marketing strategies. And Kyle is actually going to talk about how you can do that in the future. Just yesterday, I had a newer colleague here at One North tell me a story where he was working for a well-known technology company who was trying to reach a C-level audience with a fairly pricey product or service. And they looked at a cycle like this, and they said, how can we actually collapse these things? So their idea was, how do we go from identifying a need to formalizing a relationship and establishing trust sooner? And so their idea, looking at a model like this, was to actually send to a very select group of these C-level audience members a piece of technology in the form of a laptop or a tablet or something along those lines. As soon as this person received that device, they would open it up. And because it was heavy and because it came from a name brand, they would open it. And when they turned it on, as soon as they turned it on, it actually directly connected via a cellular network to a salesperson at that organization who had a presentation that was prepared for that particular buyer to walk through the various ways in which the technology provider could provide value to the client. They had tremendous success, but what they did ultimately was collapse that buying cycle. So these are just one example of a technique that you could use using a cycle like this to short-circuit the buying process. So skipping forward, I want to just talk a little bit about why we like the model. And the reason we like the model is that it's all about balance, right? And I'll sort of go to Newton's third law here and say that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. That holds true for the cycle as well. When your client identifies a need, that is when you have to generate awareness. When your client's researching a solution, that's when you need to drive consideration. And these things need to be in balance. So for example, if you were to do a great job, spend all of your marketing budget generating awareness, but you're not able to service them to the point where they are actually considering your product, or your follow-up isn't what it needs to be. Or if you're not taking good care of your current clients, then you can generate all the awareness in the world. The reality is no one's going to buy from you because you don't have loyal references. And so when you think about the model, you can look at this and say, are my marketing efforts in balance across the entire cycle? So with that, we wanted to get into a few aspects of the cycle specifically. And so first, I want to focus on generating awareness. So you might think that big jet engines and refrigerators don't have a lot in common. Furthermore, the buyers of these things don't have a lot in common. One is probably a very, very technical B2B buyer, and I should say buyers plural because it's probably more than one buyer. It's a group of buyers. The other is a purchase from a consumer, generally speaking, who is probably not as technical and just wants to keep their stuff cold. This is a pretty big challenge if you are a marketer, and how do these markets act differently? Well, Beth Comstock is actually the person that has to solve this challenge. She is the CMO of General Electric, and in addition to selling big jet engines and refrigerators, she also has to sell financial products. But what's interesting about what she says is that the zero moment of truth, when people research products before buying, applies across all customer bases, whether they're buying that big jet engine or refrigerator. And so I wanted to talk for a minute about that part of the cycle that's generating awareness and introduce this concept of the zero moment of truth. So I'll take a step back here, and I'll talk about the first moment of truth, because that's actually what came first. Back in 2005, a Wall Street Journal article wrote about Procter & Gamble's philosophy that they had, through research and otherwise, found out that the first 7 seconds when somebody walked into an aisle at the grocery store and saw a product, all of the combined advertising experiences, et cetera, with that product came back and helped them make a buying decision. And that was a critical period, that first 7 seconds when they saw the product in the aisle. They dubbed that the first moment of truth. In fact, they took it so seriously, they had a whole director of First Moment of Truth. This is a job title, etc. But what's happening today, and largely this is driven by the explosion of digital, is that something's happening before that. Something happens before somebody walks into, say, a grocery store, or before they call your phones to get information from you. And that is called the zero moment of truth. And this is a term that's been coined by Google, but supported by a variety of B2C and B2B marketers. And the idea is that once the stimulus has occurred, once your potential client has identified that need, they go into a period of organic discovery, where they start to go to the web, they start to talk to their friends, and they investigate various solutions. They can do this without ever contacting you. That zero moment of truth is really when the decision-making process is made. And just a couple of statistics here. Forrester research found that the first thing 80% of people do when they confront a problem or have a question is to go online and search for an answer. I think we all do this. I'm surprised it's only 80%. And then 71% of people use the internet daily to make decisions about business purchases. So if you think it's just consumers that are making decisions based on the internet, that's not actually correct. So what's happening in that zero moment of truth? Well, this is really where content marketing comes into play. This is where they're reading reviews of your product. This is where they're asking their network about your product. This is where they might watch your videos. They might run additional searches on various product features, if you will. But the interesting thing about the zero moment of truth is that these experiences and the things that influence your client or potential client during the zero moment of truth are not all branded experiences. Most of these are unbranded. They're not controlled by you. They're controlled by other people that are experiencing your product or service as well. And that's the big difference between first moment of truth and zero moment of truth, is that generally speaking, your clients are doing organic discovery and finding out about you in ways that you don't always control. So now that we've talked a little bit about generating awareness and the zero moment of truth, I wanted to look at driving consideration a little bit more. And this is really the top part of the funnel. And we'll start with sort of the buzzword of the day, and that buzzword, of course, is content marketing. Content marketing has exploded. I feel like over the last 4 years or so, the number of people that have content marketing on their resume, the number of conferences that have sprung up is just fairly dramatic. But content marketing is fairly straightforward, and frankly, our clients have been doing content marketing for a long time because they're all knowledge-based businesses where they're constantly pushing out content about their fields of expertise. But content marketing is delivering education or useful information to your audience. But the key to make content marketing successful is to add one more ingredient to it, and that's context marketing. And that's really adding an element of time and context to that useful and educational information that you're providing. And I found this graphic, and I really, really liked it because it is so simple. If you think about context and driving consideration, there are a number of ways you can provide that context, and they're all listed here. And I was thinking about this. We all practice context marketing in our offline activities. As an example, if I go to a cocktail party that is not work-related and somebody asks me what I do, I don't immediately launch in to a commercial for One North. And the reason I do is because I have context. I know that the location I'm in is not appropriate for talking about One North. I know that the time of day probably isn't appropriate for talking about One North. I know that the intent of the person who's asked this question is really just trying to make conversation, not that they're actually about to buy a product or service from me. I don't even know their role, right? I don't know if they're a buyer. I don't even know if they're in the workforce, et cetera. So we do this naturally in our offline activities, but now we're seeing it move to online activities. I was talking to Kalev earlier, and we were talking about an old commercial that some of you might remember. It was for Computer Associates, where a software salesperson went into the office of a potential buyer, and no matter what the buyer said, the software salesman with a big grin on his face said, "Great, how much do you want to buy?" He wasn't listening. He had no context. He had no idea that the buyer had no interest in what he was there to sell. So I'll give you a few examples of context marketing. I'll give you two from that relate to President Obama. I thought this one was really interesting and sort of fun as well. So a few years ago, President Obama went to an out-of-the-way city called Darwin, Australia. Now, when the president goes on trips like this, it's generally news only for those people who really care, right, and who are really following the president. But it's not international news that the President Obama went to Darwin, Australia. So the government of Darwin, Australia realized there was a huge opportunity to create some context. And so they did what's called newsjacking. And what they did was, to generate some awareness for Darwin, Australia, is they bought 2 free policies for crocodile insurance of $50,000 for both Barack and Michelle Obama. And guess what? It wasn't, the stories weren't on the back page about President Obama visiting Darwin. Instead, they were about crocodile insurance in Darwin, Australia, and they were on the front page. The second story I'd tell is one I just heard last week. I was a marketing partner for him and at a session on predictive analytics. And what they found was that President Obama, during the course of his election campaign, when they were targeting homes for people to knock on the doors and encourage them to vote, they found that there were those people that would respond well to somebody coming to the door and knocking on them and asking them to vote for Senator Obama at that time. But they also identified the people that, and I don't know exactly how they did this, but they identified the people that would be predisposed to come to the door, recognize that one of Senator Obama's people was there bothering them, and actually that would encourage them to go to the polls and vote for the opposite candidate. So here they use context to actually win an election. And just a couple of examples that are closer to digital. This is Baker McKenzie's stock option app, and basically what this does is it looks at what location you're based in. So if you have employees in different locations around the world, you can look at the tax treatment of various stock option programs and incentive programs based on the context of location. And then another one that we've shown before many times, what we really love, it's been very successful, is the Founders Workbench from Goodwin Procter. This is an entire mini site that's set up for founders of corporations to help them with the challenges that they face. So lastly, I want to talk about loyalty and influence, key components of the relationship cycle. Harvard Business Review said that loyalty counts more and costs less than awareness. We all know this intuitively, but sometimes we don't act on it. In fact, I showed you earlier that only about 50% of us are really focused on our current clients the way we should be. But I think Amazon Prime is a fantastic example of an organization that focused on the loyalty loop. They recognized that they were generating a ton of new customers, tons of new users signing on to Amazon.com. But where the real money existed was in their loyalty loop. And so they transferred their activities, and they actually built Amazon Prime. What I love about Amazon Prime is that they encourage their loyalists to join. They encourage their loyalists to share this with others, so other family members could join. They brought in college students at a cut rate. And they built this whole program that provided a set of services around making your experience as a customer of Amazon that much better. What's fascinating is they also were able to charge for it. I believe the first fee was like $79. Now, They raised it, I think it's $99, and the news story about them raising the fee came and went in one day because no one cared. It was so valuable. But this is a very deliberate strategy on their part to focus on that loyalty. And the last comment I make is about that influence, right? Your clients are in the loyalty loop. 88% of B2B professional service buyers are likely or very likely to recommend providers to friends or colleagues. But how often as marketers are we focused on helping them do that? How are we creating programs that help people actively refer to us in a way that uninsured? So with that, I'm going to actually pause. I've gone through the relationship cycle. I've talked about why the relationship makes sense for relationship-based businesses, as well as the environment we live in, which is largely digital today. And we've looked at various segments of the relationship cycle and some tactics that you can use within those segments. And from here, I'm going to hand it over to Kalev, who's actually going to speak more practically about how you can actually implement a relationship cycle-based program.
Great. Thanks, John. So hopefully John has made you an acolyte of the relationship-based business, the relationship cycle, or convinced you that it has direct relevance for what we're doing as marketers. My task today is to actually talk about how it can actually change at least your perspective or change what you're actually doing as a marketer. So at One North, we follow what we like to call relationship-centered design. And without going into a giant treatise about what that means, we'll say just enough here to say that for us it's really not so much as a completely separate design approach from many others, but that it really lies at the center of two, which is being a sort of traditional brand-centric design, which is a marketing mindset that's really talking about defining the purpose of an organization and then articulating that purpose through really an entire range of communications. And what's also called human or user-centric design, which really focuses on the buyer, essentially, really talking about what it is they need and trying to arrange communications that get in front of them. And what we like to do is really focus in on that overlap, because that overlap, for us, is the relationship. When we, when we talk about the relationship-based business, and particularly with digital, just like you, we're bombarded with a lot of experts talking about a lot of things that have changed. We've given you some of you today. But if you take the relationship perspective, and I hope this is what you see after we go through it, there are certain truths that we hear all the time that we think have really immediate strategic impact. The first is that digital permeates every step of the cycle, whether that's in a leading or supporting role. There's really no part of that process in which digital either does not or cannot play a role anymore. It's not just about one part of the cycle. It's not just a channel through which we generate awareness. It's really something that happens every single step of the way. The second is that social communication, especially beyond branded channels. I'm not here thinking of, perhaps your firm's Twitter feed or your LinkedIn page. I'm really thinking about beyond that, truly social communications that are happening, from buyer to buyer, from user to user. And in that case, you can think of something like email even as a social communication. What all of those do with respect to what we were discussing today is actually increase the influence of influence, right? So it's probably fair to say that influence has never been a foreign concept, even to the marketing funnel. I think it's sort of understood, even if it isn't articulated in that. The reason why it's so important and why it's such a myth that it doesn't articulate it is because influence has become more important. And a big reason about why it's become more important is that it is better enabled specifically by digital. And the consequence of that is that every interaction matters more. And finally, when we think about some things like mobile, this is something that has been, a huge important trend. It's a topic that a lot of people have been thinking about. It really started in 2006, 2007. I think we're still working on it, even though it's been around for a long time. When we think about mobile, we're not really just thinking about it as a channel or a platform. We're not saying, you got to get yourself on mobile or you got to get your stuff on mobile, because that's a pretty functional task if you think about it. What it really does for us is actually increase the number and types of contexts in which we interact with clients. So John talked about the importance of context. when we look at something like the rise of mobile, what we see is that that is greatly increasing the times of day at which we interact with people. Where we're interacting with people is huge, right? It's not just in an office in front of a computer or in a home office in front of a computer. They now have an opportunity to interact with us digitally, literally just about anywhere, and also increasing the number and different types of people that are involved in our buying process. So I'm going to take 3 little case studies today that show us how we actually use the relationship cycle. And the first thing I want to make sure is clear is that we don't think of the relationship cycle as a methodology. It's a model or a framework, but it's not a process by which you punch a bunch of data in on the beginning, follow a set of defined steps, and then out comes a solution. In fact, I'll be completely frank, it isn't actually great at articulating what the solution is. What it is good at is letting you see things from a certain perspective that help you identify what the solution should be. So the 3 exercises that I'm going to go over today, these are not exhaustive. There are many other ways in which you can use the cycle, but the first is simply auditing your activities and priorities. Second will be taking a deeper look at your audiences and users, the people that are inside the relationship cycle. And the final part would be mapping your interaction opportunities. You could have also think of that as mapping the context in which you're actually communicating. So the first, auditing your activities and priorities. Often when I talk to marketers, particularly at a more senior level, a director or CMO level, if they're being very honest, they will admit that really the only opportunity that they get to take the full range, to take a look at the full range of everything they in the departments are doing is usually around budget cycle, because they have to ask for money to support it. Beyond that, they're usually so focused on different programs, projects, activities in that year that they're really shifting from one focus to another, and it's very difficult for them to really take a step back. The usual relationship cycle can actually make that a lot easier and give you a slightly more strategic view than a simple list of activities from your department and how much they'll cost. So in order to do this, actually one of the best places to start is to actually consider everything that your department does. And this is an exercise that we've done with different clients, and you just start listing them out. So they don't have to be highly logical. They don't have to be highly defined. You might find some things are overlap. Some things are kind of like a platform. Some things are really more like activities. That's okay. I think the key thing is to really just state out everything that somebody does. If we were in person, we often do this on Post-its. I know that's kind of an agency cliche. It doesn't seem like agencies can get through most meetings without having Post-its on a wall, but it's highly useful, and it actually works well for this. So if you start by listing everything that you do, the next stage is to actually take those phases of the cycle. So here we're taking the phases from your company's point of view, your firm's point of view. So generate awareness, drive consideration, follow up, establish trust and advocacy, and loyalty loop, and just sort them. For those of you that have a little bit more of a UX background or have been brought through this, this is definitely what we like to call card sorting exercise. It's pretty simple. But the key here is to simply start placing those activities at the point in the cycle that you think that they're going to have the most impact, make the most sense. You might find that you have some overlap. You might find that some activities don't neatly fit with one, but bleed out a little bit more. That's okay, right? It's simply giving you a good sense of what each activity does in order to move that process along. If you continue through all that, you end up with something that can be articulated in a matrix. So you'll have essentially, once that's all done, a list of activities and where in the cycle they're really fitting. You can actually expand that matrix if you want by adding different dimensions. So you can talk about priority. That's really something only you can answer. This is about your organization and your priorities. You can even add dimensions about resources, whether that's in terms of FTEs or actually dollar spend. Might be nice to put in both. You can then add content that you think is actually driving those, if you have particularly a content marketing point of view. And you can even add tools, digital tools, non-digital tools, what it is that you either need or have that's enabling this all to happen. As you build this out, here's some questions that we find very helpful. You can ask these questions of yourself as you're actually doing this mapping exercise or once it's done and you're taking a look at the results. But where are we lacking coverage is very often the first question that people ask themselves when we take them through this exercise, because it's really good at helping people understand that they might be focusing in one place more than the other. Where are we making the most impact is another question you can ask yourself. I think a really fascinating one, and this is a good point about the flexibility of this exercise, is how would it change if we took a different perspective based on practice, industry, or geographic market? This is an exercise that we sort of started with the supposition that we're talking about a firm as a whole, but there's absolutely no reason you can't narrow this down and talk along about a specific practice. In fact, if you are worried about coverage, that you might actually see a lot more open opportunities if you narrow the focus down a little bit. And another really interesting one, particularly within the realm of professional services, is where do we expect practitioners to contribute? Lawyers, consultants, bankers, where are they actually participating in this? Where is it not just me, not just marketing, who's conducting a lot of these activities? Finally, and the most important from my point of view, this is the one that I'm always the most interested in as I watch marketers go through this, is how accurately does it reflect your priorities? In other words, if you were to do this matrix and then hand it to someone else, would they correctly interpret what your priorities are? Would it actually reflect what you think is the most important thing for your department to do? So finally, as an additional thought in terms of how you actually go through this, we talked about coverage and we talked about priorities. I just want to make it clear that having priorities is not a problem. It's okay to be focused as a department on one part more than another. Maybe it's more important to your business. Maybe it's simply where you need the most help. The problem is when those priorities actually become unintentional, meaning you're focusing more on one part, but not because of a strategic reason. So, and here's an example that we find a lot in terms of what the outcome of a lot of these matrices are, is that it's truth that we started off. It's literally in the definition of a relationship-based business. But we all know the value of repeat clients. We all know how important it is to sell into our existing client or customer base. But strikingly few firms that we work with actually have programs designed specifically for loyal clients. And here's a couple of statistics to drive it back. This is particular to the legal industry, but it does apply in different forms to other kinds of professional services or relationship-based businesses. But in 2013, a general counsel report found that only 12% of firms always meet with clients to discuss client satisfaction, and that includes even their biggest and most important clients. And 18% of those firms never discuss satisfaction with clients. They literally never have a conversation that goes back to some form of, how did we do for you? It just doesn't happen. And the vast majority of people are in that middle part, which is sometimes. Sometimes we ask how it went, which means you don't even know how loyal they are. You're not actually showing curiosity about their level of loyalty. The second, this is a much more recent report, really just out a couple weeks ago. And this is what I thought was interesting, is it's kind of the same statistic, but from the buyer's point of view within the same industry. So asking general counsel, who, if you're not within law, are really the people who purchase legal services from large law firms. So they asked the actual consumers of these services, how often do you provide feedback? According to this survey, nearly 60%, 59% of them never actually provide feedback to the people who are providing services. Right? So this is a huge communication gap. And it's really happening in from both sides, which makes sense because it's about the relationship. But what that means is that really a lot of people are leaving this really critical stage, the loyalty loop, alone. They're kind of just letting it happen without a great deal of strategic intent in terms of what's defining their activities. The next exercise is actually really just a flipped version of the first. We talked about balance. We talked about balance at several points. So the previous exercise is kind of just helping you get a better view of what you're doing overall as a department. This exercise is very similar. It's just doing it from your buyer's or your purchaser's point of view. So this time, look at the client's point of view and think about everything that they actually need out of you. Information requests, content that they might be requesting, what it is that they're searching for or looking for. Think about everything that they actually need from your department, particularly outside the matter or the work itself, because I think that's going to be the most helpful from the marketing's point of view. It's not that, what gets conducted inside the actual engagement is unimportant, but as a matter of focus for marketing, think about everything else that they need, and then do the similar sort of exercise. You'll probably find that some of this information comes in at different ports. So here, when they're really researching a solution, they need those research reports, that kind of key thought leadership that you're publishing, right, in order to sort of better help them better understand the solution, which then helps them understand who can actually solve it. In an active evaluation, they often need a lot of information from you. That's when you're responding to RFPs. They might be asking for suggestions for different kinds of suppliers. They might need a lot of information like case studies or other information that really helps prove that you have the expertise that you need. And in their loyalty loop, they might be looking for thought leadership again, but from a different perspective. It might be about keeping up to date. It might be about continuing education within their field study, all of that information. Same thing, you'll end up with another matrix about what kind of content meets different sort of needs. You can add different dimensions. So once you have their needs, you can actually list what kinds of content do I have that fits into this need, because there may not be a one-to-one, or you might have multiple pieces of content that one needs. Another key question to ask yourself is how and where do they find it, right? We mentioned that when people are researching a solution, we find that they're definitely doing a lot of web searching, but they're also doing a lot of person-to-person communication. They're actually a lot of calling people that they know, people that they trust. Sometimes those people that they're calling are you. Sometimes it's other people that they know. They may actually be working within a digital reference network like LinkedIn in order to find more of that information. And finally, what's the best way to deliver that content? How do they want to receive it? Here's some questions that you can ask yourself while you're going through this exercise. Do we fully comprehend their needs? In fact, this can be sometimes a struggle. People sometimes find themselves admitting, I'm not sure what they need at this stage. Active evaluation tends to be really easy to fill out when we get into identifying need or try to fill out the opposite end. Sometimes even many of the best marketers we work with, it will admit that they don't fully understand what it is that people need. Also, are we fully meeting their needs? A key point for really understanding the cycle is how are their needs changing over time. And that's another reason why I like this exercise, is that it doesn't just list, this is what our clients need, as though it were a discrete or single transaction, right? This is a process that can take months to get through, and it's entirely natural and appropriate that what they need changes over time, so it's a good question to ask yourself. As well as what's the best way to deliver, where do they look, and what kinds of data do they need. One of the thoughts that we have here, one of the outcomes that we have here in terms of guiding our clients through this exercise is to be very sure that they understand what their understanding is based on, meaning how do they know what it is that a client needs. Most relationship-based businesses understand their clients pretty well. We have pretty close relationships with it. So in order to go through this exercise, we're very often relying on the people who have the closest relationships, namely the practitioners. So we're relying on the consultants. We're very often relying on the lawyers or the bankers or the people who actually provide the services to tell us what it is that the clients need. That works in many situations, but it doesn't work every single time. And it should give you pause. You should think hard about how much can you trust that. Not because anybody is lying, but because very often that instinct that they develop is not based on actual conversations. They're not actually asking people what they need. It's really highly anecdotal. And some of the research that we've seen has raised a lot of questions for us specifically on this point. McKinsey published a research report a little more than a year ago in their brand awareness survey, specifically on B2B businesses. And one of the most striking outcomes of this report was that there was an almost complete disconnect about needs, specifically around loyalty. So these statistics are again about the loyalty loop. What they found was what they did was ask really the top global B2B companies, what do you think drives customer loyalty? And then they went and asked those customers, what actually drives your loyalty? And what they found was a complete disconnect. Almost none of if you see here the orange bars that are very long, almost none of the typical characteristics that the companies themselves thought drove loyalty were even statistically significant. So statements about that you have global reach, that you promote diversity, that you practice sustainability, that you are, shaping the direction of your entire market, none of that was even statistically significant from the customer's point of view. It just literally falls flat. On the flip side, the top areas that customers, purchasers of, top B2B companies care about are really almost never mentioned by the companies themselves. So what the clients cared about was, do they care about honest, open dialogue? Do they act responsibly? Do they fit in well with my values and beliefs? Are they a leader in the field? There's only significant overlap on certain things, like has a high-level specialist expertise, some very minor correlation with being a driver of innovation, and actually some surprising negative correlation with whether or not you have low prices or offer significant value over competitors. So the real point to this is to say that it's probably worth doing some actual research to understand what it is that clients need or want out of these different stages. And finally, for mapping your interactions, this is kind of a fun exercise. And this is really just taking a look at the cycle again, but it's going to take a look at it from both sides, and it's going to say, what kinds of interactions do we actually have with people? We suggest that you definitely include digital, but you also include non-digital. You definitely think about impersonal interactions. You think about the print interactions that you're still engaged in. And you simply map out upon this along the different strategy how important you think it is. So we actually usually just draw lines, right? So we might say, they use the web a lot in terms of us generating awareness, and when they're actually trying to identify a need, they're doing a lot of web searching. But as they go down and further in the cycle, they're using web a lot less. In person, the flip actually switches, almost in the same way. They might be looking for information, but at some point they're transitioning to talking to a person. And email and social might fit into slightly different patterns. This really just helps you understand, the range of different interactions and what you might need to focus on at different stages. So, again, things to ask yourself: where your interaction is currently limited. Is there opportunity to improve a particular interaction at a particular point in time? You might say, yes, it is used a lot, but no, I'm not actually thinking or doing a lot about it. Another key point is how well coordinated are those different kinds of interaction. We find big silos and big divisions very often between very carefully crafted digital communications and other impersonal communications, which are often in the hands of a completely different set of people. What is the client's experience in those interactions? Do all those different experiences align to a single brand? Or am I really just coordinating off the brand only on the things that marketing controls? And then finally, do you know how to actually measure the effectiveness of those interactions? And that can be very tricky, right? We can, a really great digital tool will often produce really great reports, but how, for example, do I measure the effectiveness of in-person interactions? How do I measure the effectiveness of email interaction? How do I understand how all that is contributing? So for this, I think, the one thing that I wanted to make sure is you think about the different kinds of interactions is that there is no one kind of interaction that can govern the entire cycle, right? We're no longer in an age where you can buy a single system and it's just going to carry your buyer through an entire process and understand every single step of the way. It's a simple fact of life that your client's experience is always going to be made up of multiple discrete interactions. And that has led to, or has coincided with, a huge explosion in the number of communication channels and tactics they manage. I don't have a solution for that. I know we're probably all experiencing the pain of having ever more places in which our content is appearing, or which our communications is appearing. All I can say to you is that I think a big part of marketing's job now is to ensure that all those discrete communications and all those discrete interactions coordinate to create a comprehensive brand experience. So here's just some final statistics that we have found about the current state and how well people are doing. I hope this makes you feel better if you are feeling a little bit overwhelmed by all those channels. 86%, as John said, content marketing is a huge buzzword. 6% of B2B firms say they engage in content marketing, so everyone's doing it. However, not even half of them feel that their content marketing is effective. And finally, 75% of firms either don't have a content strategy or they don't document it, right? Which means people are putting content out there, but they really don't feel like they're doing it in ways that are aligned to specific goals. So some final thoughts, John. I think, it's really relatively simple. We've carried through a couple different exercises. We invite you to try some of those on your own, to take some of the data that we've given you. I think when we really boil it down, it comes to a couple simple facts. First, you need to accept that a relationship-based business is different in a way, that your buyers follow a different process, and that our attempt at the relationship cycle is a way of articulating how and why that process is different. And the second really is that your strategies and your tactics, which is a lot of what I talked you through, should really be informed by that kind of understanding, right? In order to make it useful, you really should think hard about how your overall strategic view, but also each individual tactic aligns into the process your clients actually take.
Great. So with the final few minutes we have to spare, we're going to do a quick Q&A session. Okay, so our first question is just, where do I start in this whole process?
I know Kalev and I both have opinions on this, but I'll say actually where we started with it here at One North. We use the relationship cycle actually in planning our own activities. And what we actually do, and this is just one take on it, is we plan our revenue for the year, and we look at where that revenue is going to come from. Both historically, does it come from current clients, does it come from new clients? Do we anticipate that trend to continue? Are there ways that we can affect those trends? And then once we understand what the makeup of our revenue, what we want that to look like, we then look at the various phases of the cycle where we need to invest our marketing and sales dollars in order to produce the revenue mix that we want. And this year, without getting into too many details, we identified 3 areas of the cycle where we are investing particularly to make sure that we're fostering a strong cycle, both from awareness all the way through loyalty loop. So we found it to be a very simple but very useful tool in terms of planning our revenue. So that's the way we approach where to start.
Great. The next question is, do you think the relationship cycle is true for all B2B organizations or just relationship-centric ones?
That's a fantastic question, one that we've asked ourselves, because while we target a defined group of relationship-based organizations, everything from law firms, investment banks, consulting firms, et cetera, organizations where knowledge and a particular practitioner is a very important ingredient to the overall value proposition that they have. What we've also found is that many clients come to us that might not have the same profile as the organizations I just mentioned, but they are still relationship-based organizations. And just to give you an example, we had an organization come to us that distributes technical equipment. And while you might think, well, technical equipment, how is that relationship-based? Well, one of their key elements and their key go-to-market strategies is to engage with a set of independent channel partners that actually sell their product. And that relationship that they have with those channel partners, not necessarily with the end buyer, but with the channel partners, is critical to their ability to sell to the end customer. So we applied the same relationship-based cycle to their relationship, not with the end customer, but instead with the channel partners, and produced a campaign for them that drove the areas that need to drive the relationship cycle. So I'd say that sort of the unintended benefit of the relationship cycle and the definition of relationship-based business is that we find that there are relationships in all sorts of B2B businesses.
I think if I were to answer that completely honestly, I would say yes, actually. I think it applies to most businesses. I think if you're a really attentive watcher of this webinar, you might have noticed a bit of a sleight of the hand at the beginning, which is that a lot of our examples actually come from, we talked about relationship businesses, and then we're pulling examples from companies that you might not think fit, like Amazon, like GE. The way that I think, the most honest way to answer that is I think there are many companies that are outside traditional B2B and outside professional services who are beginning to reinterpret themselves as fundamentally relationship-driven.
Great. So we're just about out of time. That wraps up the Q&A session. If we weren't able to get to your question, we'll be following up with you after the webinar. Also, if you have additional questions or are interested in learning more about One North's relationship cycle, feel free to reach out to the marketing team here at One North. The email is marketing@onenorth.com. Thanks, everyone, for joining, and have a great rest of your day.